world that we live in today, and we actually take very much for granted, doesn't exist if D-Day fails. The idea that international alliances and international institutions like the United Nations, that idea was far-fetched in 1944, and D-Day proved that it not only was possible, but that it could actually achieve what it set out to do. And without that achievement, without that show of success, are we still living in essentially the imperial world that we lived in for hundreds of years before? Failure was an option, and that failure would have completely remade what we all take for granted today, whether or not it's democracy, human rights, decolonization, the international world order, America as a superpower. None of these things would have been possible.
So joining us now on Open Book is Michel Paradis. He's a leading human rights lawyer. He's an historian. He's an acclaimed author, and he's written a best-selling book. And I will tell you, because I am a World War II buff, and this is my favorite part of American history, this is my favorite book of 2024 thus far. The title of the book is The Light of Battle, Eisenhower, D-Day, and the Birth of the American Superpower. There's also a brilliant article in The Atlantic written by Mr. Paradis. So welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I'm excited.
I appreciate you coming on. Before we get into the book, tell us a little bit, introduce yourself to our viewers and listeners. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Sure. So I grew up in and around basically Allentown, Pennsylvania, if anyone knows that. Moved to New York when I was 17. Went to college and law school here. Then initially was planning on being a big-time Wall Street lawyer, which I started doing before I had a good quarter-life crisis, as they call them now, and went off and got a PhD at Oxford as a way of running away with the circus. And while there, I actually was a lawyer. And so while I was working my PhD, I started doing a lot of international human rights work. And that, in turn, got me into all sorts of interesting places, interesting cases. Some of my sort of more, I think, larger contributions, if I can call them that, were in the Guantanamo litigation, where I was ultimately hired by the Department of Defense to represent a number of detainees, which, as you can imagine, is an extremely difficult, strange, complicated job all by itself.
Yeah, no kidding.
And so, yeah. And so from there, I continued on. I've written a couple books now, and the most recent is about Eisenhower.
So what drew you to Eisenhower?
I think, the thing that drew me most to Eisenhower, I heard a quote actually from the other day that basically said, art is there to tell us and show us the things we overlook and tell us about the things we overlook. And, Eisenhower is someone who, as prominent as he is, right? He was even on the coins when I was a kid. I think is often overlooked. He's, probably one of the most powerful generals in all of human history. Yet he is raised by religious pacifists in Kansas. He comes from basically nothing to the highest, echelons of power, not only in the United States, but in the world. He commands probably the most complicated, intricate military operations of, again, all of human history. Yet in his time in the army, he always has as his fallback plan, I'm going to go off and become a gaucho, basically a cowboy in Argentina. He's just such an interesting person, and his public image is almost deliberately boring. And that, as a writer, just for me, became utterly fascinating because he's as complicated and in some ways as contradictory as America itself. And he's a quintessential American figure. And so to me, that understanding him, getting behind that received iconography that we have about Eisenhower was really what drew me to the project more than anything else.
So it's interesting because a lot of Americans don't realize this because, we see history, of course, with all of this great 2010 vision. I don't think hindsight is 2020, by the way. I think it's 2010. I think it's way more clear than 2020. And so we go back through history, we see these things as inevitable. But as you write in the book, his rise is anything but inevitable. He hurts his knee. He's playing my alma mater, Tufts University, and he hurts himself at West Point. It's not clear how he's going to progress there. He goes to work for MacArthur. He's the antithesis of General MacArthur in terms of his personality. But then he's very good friends with people like George Patton, another guy that he's very different from, Omar Bradley, who I think is probably most similar to Ike. But how does he rise?
You
How
know,
does he rise?
yeah, it's a great question, and it's what I was fascinated by. I was like, how does that actually happen? How do you get from the middle of Kansas to where he was? And I think a couple different things. An important one is he really knew how to cultivate mentors, and that's an underappreciated skill, particularly for young people. But the idea that there are people who have, because of their life experience, because of what they've accomplished, because of their education, any number of things, are going to know more than you, and you have to always look for what can this person teach me, and have the humility to come to people and really be, and this is something that's taught in the military but I think is rare outside of it, is followership, right? The idea that your job is to help someone else get their job done. And Eisenhower understood that really well, and always did look for mentors who he could learn from something from. And also, I think, had the basic humility of that he looked at everybody as someone he could learn something from. And so he accumulates ideas, ways of behaving, styles of leadership, just even ticks and expressions from people over time. And one of the great sort of joys of the research of this book was trying to really put his life together and figure out how he collected all of these ideas. And as you said, it's everything from the gridiron, playing football, but I think probably even more important, coaching football, because after he blows his knee out, he can't play football anymore. He might not even stay in the Army after that because he's injured. But one thing he realizes that he's quite good at, and certainly something the Army really appreciates, is someone who can coach a winning football team, particularly against toughs. And so they have, he develops, a philosophical sense from one of his mentors in Panama. So he reads, great thinkers going, well back, not just in military history, but in philosophy. And you can see him sort of picking up these ideas from people as diverse as Karl von Clausewitz and Nietzsche. And he understands, I think, fundamentally that, the world is better off if we approach it trying to solve people's real problems. And one of the, I think, most admirable traits, and the book is not hagiography, right? I try to present him warts and all, but I think one of his most admirable traits is a aversion to people who are way too certain about anything. Right? He has that. He's not only humble himself, but he projects that onto other people, so that when people are fanatical about ideologies, particularly, he is suspicious of them, and he thinks carefully, and he understands that that's something to be avoided. And I think that's why he's the 20th century figure who fought the two great fanatical ideologies of the 20th century: fascism in Europe and Soviet communism after that. And so that I think is how he learned to become the kind of person he was, particularly where he was from, was through humility and really looking to learn from others with a truly open mind.
So yeah, you're correct. It's not a hagiographic book, and I'm going to pay you a huge compliment, Michelle. You write like a fiction writer. I feel like I'm inside the brains of these people, and you're also exposing their flaws. So, who are some of your favorite fiction writers that you've been drawn to, whose writing style has influenced you?
For me, the ones I'm probably basically stealing, like Tom Wolfe. I drank.
Yeah.
I remember when I first read Tom Wolfe, and I know a lot of people have had this experience. You just read it, and you just can't believe you're reading something that clear with that much insight that just has so much energy behind it. That
Which of his books do you like the most?
Honestly, The Right Stuff. I've read that book probably now twice. I love all his books. Don't get me wrong; there are a lot, and I can even rank them for you if you want to go on. If you want to go deep on Tom Wolfe. But I remember the first time I read The Right Stuff, and there's that opening chapter where he's talking about basically just how dangerous it is to be a fighter pilot, and he has this almost poetic sort of device that he uses where he says they take the bridge coats out and all the little men line up, and then they start talking about, oh well, he should have pulled the injection cord faster, or everyone knows they're supposed to look for their bolts. And you just in that very, very short opening passage, you not only just have, again, gorgeous writing, but you just get into the heads of these people so quickly and so fast, and you see the world the way they do, even though they don't realize, their own sort of narrow view of the world. And that's what's so brilliant, I think, about Tom Wolfe as a writer. He really captures people as they are, warts and all, but that makes you love them too because they're fascinating. So Tom Wolfe is obviously a huge influence on me. Toni Morrison, I remember reading her, and in a similar kind of thing. I remember it was The Bluest Eye was a book I read when I was in college, and I still remember it. Just sometimes like prose just wash over you in a way that really transforms you and makes you just think about the world in an entirely different way. Who else do I like now? There's a guy now who's a novelist who's really interesting, by the name of Bernard. No. I'm going to screw up his first name, but his last name is Labatut. He's a Chilean writer who's been translated into English. He just wrote a novelistic biography called The Maniac of von Neumann. And he writes these books basically about 20th century scientists. So it's like heavy stuff that I'm often like holding on with my fingernails in terms of like the science he's talking about. But it's this just utterly humane portrait of these really strange scientific and mathematical figures. He did another book a couple of years ago called When We Cease to Understand the World. That was just riveting. I'd never read anything like it. So
I appreciate you giving me that detail, because it's when I read your book, I said this man is a man of letters, and this is a guy that's read a lot, because you're bringing that type of writing style into a nonfiction book, which often you don't get. Eisenhower is a very complex guy. Some people view him as a lightweight, including Franklin Roosevelt. What's interesting, though, is Eisenhower views Roosevelt as a lightweight, and Roosevelt views Eisenhower as a lightweight. And the irony is neither one of them are actually lightweights.
Yeah.
And so, but they figure it out. And of course, he's belittling Eisenhower privately, and then of course he goes out and gives this big speech endorsing him, sort of like a sports owner endorsing the manager before he's about to fire him, right? He says he's raised by Kansas pioneers, and this is our guy, right?
Yeah,
but George,
it's a
George
funny
Marshall
scene.
is another figure here. Mr. Stoicism himself. He never shows you his cards. And so what did Marshall think of Eisenhower?
I think the most important fact about Eisenhower and Marshall's relationship is that Marshall really trusted Eisenhower, because Marshall did not trust a lot of people. He had been in Washington way too long. He had been in the highest echelons of the military for decades at that point before becoming the Army Chief of Staff. He even kept like a little book. I can't remember if it was black or red, where he'd write the names of up and coming officers, and then if they did something to sort of displease him, he'd just cross their name out, sort of permanently burying them and ensuring that their careers were basically over. And Eisenhower gets onto his staff. They don't know each other. They know some of the same people, like Patton, and they have a common mentor and a guy named Fox Connor, who I write a lot about, but they don't know each other at all. And the only thing Marshall really knows about Eisenhower, other than some nice reviews he's gotten, is that he was MacArthur's guy throughout the 1930s, which is, probably something that ordinarily would have crossed him clean out of Marshall's book. George Marshall and MacArthur are probably the most different military figures America has ever.
They're literally antipodes. Of course, Truman uses Marshall's help. They come up with a plan, which they ultimately call the Marshall Plan, due to Marshall's popularity. But he fires MacArthur. So we have these very different, very strong personalities. Have you ever read In the Age of the Americans by David Fromkin?
Oh, no, I haven't. That sounds
So if you haven't read that, it's a great book about these neo-Victorian men. They're born in the late Victorian era. They become neo-Victorians, and they rise to power together, and there's an obligation. They have a public service obligation about themselves, where they're willing to subordinate themselves to the greater good of what they perceive to be going on. Of course, they go on and build the post-World War II era.
Yeah.
You got access to material that's never been seen before. So tell us about that material. How did you get access to it? And how did it influence your writing and your narrative in this book?
Yeah, a lot of it, this book, writing anything about D-Day, Eisenhower certainly, but D-Day especially, you're dealing with a fire hose of information. There's been so many great books written about D-Day that, if you're going to write something that's centered around D-Day, you better have something new to say. And the main things that were really new and interesting came from kind of approaching it fresh, actually. Because there's so much literature, my approach was basically to say, I'm just going to avoid reading as much of that as I can as I write this book. And instead, one of the things I found in Eisenhower's archives, which hadn't really been explored, interestingly enough, because they only came into the Eisenhower Library in the past 20 years, were his day planners, literally his diaries of who he's meeting with, oftentimes with occasional sort of remarks about what's going on. And basically used that to reassemble, the 6 months of his life from November 1943 up to June 1944, and almost treated the project as if like I'm just a fly on the wall. I just want to see what he's doing every day, all day, and then sort of tell you as the reader what I'm seeing go on. And the consequence of that, because I ultimately did obviously read a lot of the rest of the D-Day books, and the great ones and the not so great ones, as well as the Eisenhower biographies, is there's a whole lot of stuff that is just not part of the standard narrative of D-Day and even Eisenhower's biography that you would only know if you sort of just sat there with him, particularly the stuff that ends up not mattering. I think the biggest one and the biggest revelation in the book that I spent a lot of time unpacking, which was very difficult, was he's warned not 2 months before the invasion that the Nazis are developing nuclear weapons, and that there's reason to believe they might actually use at least radiological weapons on the D-Day beaches. And he's told this by a major that George Marshall just sends over to give him essentially a secret briefing. And he's told there's really nothing you can do about it, buddy, and you can't tell anyone really either. And he just has to sit with that and figure out how to use this information. And one of the fascinating things I found was this oblique letter that he writes to Marshall just a couple of weeks before the invasion, paraphrasing a little bit, but basically saying, hey, I met with that guy a couple of weeks ago. Anything to worry about? Anything you can add? And Marshall never says anything to him about it. And so when he's sending, those men into the storm on June 5th to launch the D-Day invasion, he has no idea if the Nazis are basically going to start using nuclear weapons or something they had never heard of. Right? There are all of these, that was really the fun of the book, was to, really be there in 1944 before everyone knows how it's going to turn out, and really when they all think it's going to be a disaster. Right? They at one point, Eisenhower's chief of staff, and this is a couple weeks before the invasion, says he thinks there's a 50-50 chance of success. And a 50-50, that's a 50-50 chance of catastrophic failure, of the worst kind, world-altering failure. And so to be in that moment, in that pressure cooker, where there's so much going on that ended up maybe not mattering or didn't because we won, but was what was on Eisenhower's mind, and understanding Eisenhower, right? How did he deal with all of that? How did he deal with the problem of civil rights? How did he deal with the problem of the fall of the British Empire? All of these things are all going on in all
the Suez crisis when he's president. But
absolutely.
You say something in the book that I want to get your reaction to in person. The plan is to have 80,000 troops to go. Would eventually becomes Operation Overlord, but Ike thinks it's not enough troops, and
Yep.
he goes to Bernard Montgomery, and I'd like you, if you don't mind, to give us a little bit of Bernard Montgomery's personality with his various peccadillos.
Yeah.
And he flatters him, and he tells him, listen, I got to get 160,000 troops. You can run it.
Yeah.
Okay. And this is a classic lesson about the way you gain power is by giving power away. And Ike understands this intuitively. And of course, Montgomery, this plays to his ego. He goes back to the British forces, and he helps Ike get the troop count up to 160,000. Tell us about that relationship. And for those listeners that don't know, we have a lot of young listeners who Bernard Montgomery is. Tell us a little bit about him.
Yeah. Bernard Montgomery is, to this day, one of the most celebrated British generals, and certainly the most celebrated British general of the Second World War. He leads Great Britain's major successful campaigns in North Africa. He comes to get the nom de guerre Montgomery of El Alamein after his greatest victory, and he is often described as so much like George Patton as to explain why they hated each other so much, because he's a completely ungovernable subordinate. He is an astounding prima donna. He's quite brilliant, actually, as a strategist, as a military strategist, and he's beloved by the men under his command. And he and Patton hate each other. They actually, in the invasion of Sicily, essentially get into a race to see who can get to the capital fastest, which they always lord over one another, essentially. But Eisenhower and Montgomery, despite Eisenhower and Patton being actually quite great friends, Eisenhower and Montgomery never like each other, maybe with the single exception of the sort of month leading up to D-Day when they begin to warm to one another. If the cliche is that everyone likes Ike, Montgomery does not like Ike. They get off to the wrong foot when they first meet, when Montgomery sort of scolds him for smoking during a briefing. Eisenhower is and remains basically a chain smoker at this point. And so when Eisenhower, and also, and this is, I think, it just is an important point, he does not want Montgomery in this job. He asks for a different general, a British general that he had worked very closely with in North Africa and was very eager to have be the lead of at least the British portions of Operation Overlord. That request gets overruled, and he's essentially assigned Bernard Montgomery against his will, in an act that he almost thinks is sabotage by the British. Because the other, fact that why he gives Montgomery this bear hug when he needs to enlarge the invasion is because the British don't want to do the invasion, right? The British are opposed to Operation Overlord for some good reasons, but some less good reasons, like dealing with their own empire.
Yeah, some of it's empire centric, right? And they have resources and bases in the Mediterranean that they're trying to preserve, and they want America's help to keep the empire going. Of course, Roosevelt wants none of that. He has disdain for the British Empire. People forget that Roosevelt lived many years as an adolescent in Germany. He speaks fluent German. He's listening to Hitler's speeches in German, and he understands the danger that Hitler represents. But he also doesn't like the British Empire, but he's a charming guy, right? What did Churchill say about him? Meeting him for the first time, it's like opening a bottle of champagne. And so they get together. But Monty is an interesting guy to me because he's loved by the troops. You point out that the victory in El Alamein is one part him, but he also got a lot of air support.
Yeah.
And he also got a lot of other people helping him to get to that victory. But here we are with these characters, and we're about to assault this beach. And of course, as you know, my uncle, who I'm named after, was part of that assault. He was one of the first guys off a Higgins boat in Omaha Beach. Interestingly enough, he survived, as he told us the story, because of where the boat landed and where it was positioned relative to the pillboxes with the machine gun fire. They happened to be next to a decoyed minefield. So a couple of these guys nervously ran into the minefield. My uncle said, okay, those guys are going to get blown up by these mines. But it turned out there weren't any mines. The Germans were trying to push the infantry into the pillboxes. They had run out of cement and rebar and so forth. And so they discovered by accident that they could come up around the Germans where they had landed because of this decoy minefield. That's how he survived on the beach.
That's incredible. That's a great story. Oh,
yeah.
my God.
Yeah. Well, I teased it at him. He never wanted to talk about it. It was after Private Ryan. He talked about it. He talked about what happened on that beach. But you've done a beautiful job in this book. I guess I got a couple more questions for you if you don't mind. Okay.
Yeah, of course.
You brought these people to life. It was not clear that this was going to be a success. When I read your book, I tried to take it from that point of view. And so take us through what would have happened had it not been successful, because you did research on that as well. So what's the alternative history? They fail on the beach, then what?
Yeah.
Possibly the communists, possibly Stalin
Yeah.
cuts a deal with Hitler at that point, right?
For sure, right? Because you got to remember, the United States was not, the superpower that it is today. The United States hadn't led a major military operation in the world to that point, and certainly one of Roosevelt's big reasons for pushing Operation Overlord as hard as he did, over British objections, was both a show of strength to the Soviets, as well as to help the Soviets to take the pressure off the Eastern Front, where about 75 to 90% of the German army, depending on how you count it, was in bitter fighting. And so had that failed, the United States would have been exposed as a paper tiger. What would the Soviets have done with that information? If they would have kept fighting, they would have, probably had dominance over the European continent for, many decades to come. But that's only if they kept fighting, because they were taking enormous losses and very well could have just said, look, the Americans and the British aren't coming to the rescue. We should, cut another truce with Hitler, and basically allow Western Europe to remain fascist and Eastern Europe to remain communist. The only strategy available to the United States at that point would be Britain's strategy of essentially empire securing and expansion in the Mediterranean. But I don't know that that would have been a politically viable strategy, because one thing that we forget is 1944 is an election year. And as much as Roosevelt certainly harbored suspicions of the British Empire, the American public was deeply suspicious of the British Empire. The war in Europe is remembered with way more nostalgia than it was, believed to than the public supported it at the time. Most Americans wanted to fight the Japanese and be done with it, and most Americans, particularly those sort of following in the sort of the afterglow of people like Charles Lindbergh and the America First movement, saw American involvement in the European war as simply being a toady to Great Britain, which we had done in World War One, to essentially disastrous results. And so I don't even know that we would have stayed in any major significant way in the European theater. It's at least up for grabs. Would Roosevelt had even won re-election in 1944? I think that's totally up for grabs. And so you start immediately seeing that the world that we live in today, and we actually take very much for granted, doesn't exist if D-Day fails. Maybe something else would have grown up, but the idea that international alliances and international institutions, like the United Nations, which is what the Allies called themselves at the time, and ultimately formed what we now call the United Nations Organization, that idea was far-fetched in 1944, and D-Day proved that it not only was possible, but that it could actually achieve what it set out to do. And without that achievement, without that show of success, what kind of world are we still living in? Essentially the imperial world that we lived in for hundreds of years before. I think there's a very good case to be made for that. So yeah, the failure was an option, and that failure would have completely remade what we all take for granted today, whether or not it's democracy, human rights, the decolonization, the international world order, America as a superpower. None of these things would have been possible.
So I want to test a theory on you. Then I'm going to go to the last few questions. I read the book and had that conclusion that there's obviously a butterfly effect in our worlds, and D-Day was a vector that took us in a direction that I perceive to be positive, at least. But we have this tendency to forget wars. When the living memory of the war dies, and this is civilians being killed and their parents remember it, or our soldiers, we saw several of them a week back. They're in their wheelchairs now. Some of them that are surviving are in their 90s or plus 100. As we get the living memory expires, we have a tendency, Barbara Tuchman wrote about this in The Guns of August, we have a tendency towards nationalism, glorifying war, increasing our harsh rhetoric towards each other. Yet after wars like this, you have 60 million people die. There's more of a union situation, European Economic Union, NATO, collaboration, try to defend freedom through alliances. It does seem on the periphery to be breaking down again. Do you think that's because we've lost our memory of the war, or what do you think is happening, Michelle?
Today in the world, I think that's part of it. I always found one of the most remarkable things about Eisenhower's presidency is he's the only president in the 20th century to not send American forces abroad in a new war, which is amazing to think about, right? That includes, fairly short-lived presidents in the 1920s or Jimmy Carter. And I think it's because and this is also at a time of incredible international danger and instability, right? This is the beginning of the Cold War, when the world is on a knife edge under the threat of nuclear weapons. But he understands that sending men into battle means. Like, he had seen off the 101st Airborne the night before D-Day, and I think the most poignant thing I read about that moment, which is very well chronicled, but this piece of it I had never seen before, that each man he shook hands with, he looked him in the eye and talked to him as a person, and he made himself do it because he had just been given intelligence or an estimate that at least half of these men might die, and so he knew what war was deep in his bones, and he was sensitive to that. He knew it was necessary, especially to combat dangers like fascism, but he also knew that it had to be a last resort, and that it was ultimately a waste of life and of opportunity. And you see that in his presidency. And so I do think there's a big part of this is we have not had a large war, certainly the way our grandparents did and your uncle did. I think there also is a growing sort of, for lack of a better word, boredom, right? And this relates to having a war, but we take for granted. When I said freedom, democracy, and decolonization, like, it sounds like a bumper sticker, but to say those words as the directions that we should take as a matter of international policy, to say that in 1942 or 43 was like bananas, right? Everyone would have thought that was at best naive, and at worst a cynical ploy, and yet we did it, and we built a world that has grown in prosperity, in literal population, in peace, far to surpass anything that had come before. And there is, I think, just like you said in Barbara Tuchman's writing, there is this sense that once people live in peace for too long, they start grabbing on to other sources of meaning that are, that seem more ineffable than solving real problems that real people have in the real world, because we have a lot of real problems in the real world today.
There's no question. I just
Yeah.
find it's an interesting time. We have this great system that we put together, and now the system is under threat. It's almost as if the stability of the system and the length of that stability has created some level of instability. But okay, so each of my authors, I with my production staff, we come up with 5 famous words. I'm going to read out the word. I want to get your reaction before I let you go. You can give me a sentence, a word, a thought. Okay.
I was not told there'd be a quiz, but I'm happy to.
All right, but it's not really a quiz.
No,
It's really your insight. You ready?
Sure.
So if I say the word Churchill, you think of what?
I think of probably the most literary world leader we've ever had.
Yeah, incredibly gifted man.
Incredibly
right?
gifted, absolutely.
Foresight, but a real imperialist, though, no?
Genuine, absolutely. He was a full-blooded Victorian as well.
Victorian imperialist. Yep.
Yeah,
right back to the Boer War. Okay, I say the word Roosevelt, and I mean Franklin Roosevelt, not Teddy. So I say FDR. You say what?
He is probably the canniest politician that we had in the 20th century. There's a reason he got 4 terms, and it's because he understood politics, and not in a dirty word sense, although he understood that too. But he understood that politics was really about people and meeting people's needs, and so that he could mobilize just a country that was deeply and violently divided, far more than we are today, to be perfectly frank with you. 2 common causes, both in combating the Depression, obviously, and then ultimately in World War II. So yeah, he is the consummate politician, and I mean that in a positive way.
Yeah, and listen, he's being revised negatively now because of the Japanese internment, the fact that he didn't allow the Jews to come into the country during the Holocaust. There's a series of things. None of us think he's perfect, but to me, he's the quintessential American leader. He really forged the American century and gave birth to a much wider middle class because of his objectives and policies. Okay, I say the word Operation Overlord. You say what?
When you say Operation Overlord, I don't want to repeat myself, but I do think it was not only the beginning of the end of World War II, but it was the beginning of an entirely new world that benefited enormously from American leadership, but was not even defined by American leadership. And this is just one point, if I can make sort of to tell you what I mean, is when Eisenhower announces the invasion of Normandy to the European continent, he doesn't say the United States once. He says the United States is here to liberate you, or sorry, the United Nations, which is what the Allies called themselves at the time. The United Nations are here to liberate you. Not America is here to conquer you, but the United Nations are here to liberate you. And it was true. There were a dozen countries participating in that operation. And so that's what I think of when I think of Operation Overlord.
And I think he, from a leadership perspective, he did a very good job of explaining that unlike the First World War, which you appropriately point out, we're going to meld the troops. And so we're going to make it one fighting force as opposed to national fighting forces on the battlefield. And I think that was something that we have to give him credit for. Okay, I say the word D-Day, which is different from Operation Overlord, the actual event itself. You say what?
It is the hinge point in Operation Overlord. It is this one moment. It's a culmination of so many historical forces and great personalities all on a single improbable day, which is why we call it D-Day, right? D-Day is just a bit of military slang for the day on which something's going to happen. It's something planners use to make sure that all the planes are running on the right schedule. And yet we call this one, June 6, 1944, we call this one day D-Day because that single day was the culmination not only of, again, all of these historical forces and great personalities, but of so much heroism and ingenuity by everyone from the buck privates hitting the beach all the way up to sort of the great leaders like General Marshall and Churchill, for that matter. So that's what I think of.
Okay, so this is my last word, but I will say this: you did ruin me, because every time I think of the word Eisenhower now, I think of this poor SOB using his pistol, shooting at a rat in a house in France, breaking tile in the bathroom as he's trying to kill the rat, and he wounds him one time and then finally gets him. But when I say the word Eisenhower, you say what?
He's the quintessential American. He comes from nothing. He lives the American dream, which often is derided as a fantasy, but he pulls it off, and he doesn't pull it off through magic or any sort of inevitable operation of the laws of a democratic society. He pulls it off through a combination of ruthlessness, to be perfectly frank, but of talent and of really the dedication to something that was not himself and his own grandiosity, and that served him incredibly well in dealing with these grandiose figures. But it also ensured that he always had his eye on the prize, just like a good football coach. No one goes to the game to see the coach; they go to the game to see a win, and that's how he viewed his life. That's how he viewed his responsibilities as a general, and I think that's also how he viewed his responsibilities as president. And we're all the better off for it.
I think you also bring out that Milton, his younger brother, had a big impact on him and was also quite helpful to him through his life. And when you say the American dream, it's interesting because this is not an American dream about money. Yeah. Because he wasn't a wealthy guy and he wasn't shooting for wealth. This is an American dream about the fulfillment of aspiration and being there to be the American that we all want him to be, which he's serving all people. And he's doing his very best to make the society better as a human being. And so all of that comes out in your wonderful book. And so apologize for the sirens in the back, but the title of the book is The Light of Battle. It's Eisenhower D-Day and the Birth of the American Superpower. It's an absolutely fantastic book. You obviously know that because you're hearing Michel Paraday talk about his book. And I wish you great success. What's next, Michel?
I'm figuring it out, but I'm really interested at the moment in turn of the 20th century New York. It's a city I love. It's where I've lived for most of my life. and it's a fascinating period. So that's what I'm looking at. That's a teaser. I don't want to commit myself just yet, but that's
Okay, yeah. Well, I've been here the whole time. I work for Giuliani, so I can tell you a lot of things that went down, and I can give you some good sources if you want to talk about some people that work for the who's now the Mad Mayor, but he at that time he was our savior here. All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us on Open Book. I hope I get a chance to interact with you again soon.
yeah, me too. Thanks so much. It was a great conversation.
You could get more economic innovation from free speech. We've learned psychologically if we teach our children to speak freely, they innovate. They go on and create Facebook or they make Apple Computer. If we inhibit their free speech, then these countries have a tendency to need to steal intellectual property. Why the insecurity about the openness? It's a vibrant, dynamic economy. We've learned that more innovation comes from liberalism. What am I getting wrong?
If I want to defend some of the aspect of illiberalism, maybe I would say that maybe the Silicon Valley model of innovation is wrong. The Silicon Valley approach is that maybe the way to get innovation is that we take Steve Jobs, we throw him into a garage, we send some LSD after him, and somehow an Apple computer comes out of the garage. But someone actually had to make that Apple computer, and that Apple computer, that iPhone, isn't being made in the US anymore. All of it is being made in China. And so they are kind of able to wait for American entrepreneurs to dream up really big ideas, something like Elon Musk or whatever. They kind of learn these big ideas. They sort of guess that American companies are no longer very good at building these ideas because over the last 25, 30 years, the American manufacturing base has mostly rusted. It's been a lot of failures in aviation, as well as the semiconductors, as well as manufacturing broadly. And then they just wait for the geniuses to kind of hand over these great ideas into the public, and then they count on Chinese manufacturing prowess to climb all of these ladders that the Americans are laying out for them.
Welcome to Open Book. I am your host, Anthony Scaramucci. Joining us today is Dan Wang. The title of the book is Breakneck, China's Quest to Engineer the Future. And I was saying to Professor Wang here that I got this book from Neil Ferguson, Dan. I guess he's at the Hoover Institute with you, maybe. He said, listen, you got to read this book. I read the book, loved it. Thank you for joining the show. But before we get into the book, let's talk about you. Tell us a little bit about your background. We know that you're a research fellow at Stanford University's Hoover History Lab, and you're now a best-selling author, but tell us how you got there.
Yeah, well, I'm having a great time at Hoover, especially when I can be surrounded by generous colleagues like Professor Ferguson and giving you my book. So this book sort of came together from after I spent about 6 years living in China between 2017 to 2023 when I was a technology analyst at an investment research firm, thinking about China's rise in semiconductors and clean technology and manufacturing broadly. And so this was a time of Donald Trump's first trade war, in which he was launching tariffs on China. This was a time when Chinese technology firms were getting more competent. This is a time when Xi Jinping was darkening its repression of all sorts of political practices. And I really thought that, we need to move beyond these 19th century political science terms like capitalist or socialist or neoliberal to describe these two big countries. After being in China, I moved to be a fellow at the Yale Law School's Paul Tsai China Center. And after thinking about China as a country that is pretty autocratic and also very much ruled by engineers, I moved back to the U.S., which is so much more ruled by lawyers. And so that sort of set up a lot of the motivations for writing this book.
It's interesting. I mean, I feel like I'm one of these uneducated Americans. I've spent some time in China, didn't fully understand it. I think the Americans looked at China as a manufacturing oasis, but didn't realize that this serpentine government would come in and take the engineering prowess and take the technology from companies like Apple and others that started manufacturing in China. And so tell us a little bit about the speed of growth in China and the success that they've had in terms of what they would call a technology transfer, but then also the strain. What made you realize that this was historically unprecedented about China?
Yeah, well, the economic growth of pulling 1.4 billion people out of extreme poverty, a few hundred million people into the middle class, and a few million people into the global elites. I mean, that is, I think, one of two central facts about China's rise over the last few decades. The other central fact is that it is a pretty authoritarian power that is very authoritarian into the 21st century, which means it has access to all of these technologies in which and intrusions in which to really impede on people's liberties and privacies. And so both facts are really important. And I think it is totally central to China's rise that it has mastered manufacturing, that it has mastered a lot of aspects of technological production. They're now in the global lead of things like automotives and clean technology and 100 other fields, and that is, impinging on a lot of traditional American competences.
Dan, I feel like we got this so wrong. I feel like 30 years ago, our elites in this country thought they won the Cold War, and they thought that by letting China into the World Trade Organization, China would move our way in terms of Western liberalism and in terms of Western freedoms. But they actually went in a different direction. They took the technology to do exactly what you said, as a more of a form of repression and social control. So how did we get it so first of all, is that statement correct? And if it is, how did we get it so wrong in your opinion?
Yeah, well, I think that statement is correct. I think that there was this expectation that China would have liberal democracy after it has liberal markets, and that turned out to have been the wrong call. Now, I wasn't making these calls. Anthony, were you in the room making some of these calls?
No,
At least,
I wasn't making the calls, but let me tell you how bad I am at this.
yeah, tell me.
I thought those were the right calls. If you had said to me, the 29, 30-year-old version of me, when these calls were being made, the 35-year-old version of me when China entered the World Trade Organization in 1999, and you said to me as a pundit or as a Wall Street observer, was this the right call? I would have said yes. So I would have, even though I wasn't in the room, Dan, I would have gotten it wrong. And so I'm just trying to understand why we got it so wrong, myself included, by the way.
Yeah, well, I think if I were in the room, 10-year-old me, I also would have gotten it wrong. But I think that, maybe a lot of this was more
You didn't
motivated.
have to rub that in, Wang. You didn't have to rub in
I'm
how
sorry,
much
man.
younger you are than me.
I'm sorry,
Jesus.
man. You got
All
more
right,
hair, so it's
keep
all
going.
good.
Keep going. All right, it was a good
So
comeback, good recovery.
I think that, I think that this was more of a strategy. This is more of a hope than a strategy. That people were reasoning from these economic fundamentals that as China grew richer, the population would necessarily want more democracy. The internet was going to break down, all of China's walls. That everything really looked like it was on America's side. That this was also a moment of hubris because America did more or less vanquished the Soviet Union, or maybe it's more accurate to say that the Soviet Union mostly self-imploded. But all of these things sort of turned into a moment when everybody believed that something like someone like Bill Clinton would lead the world into the ultimate nirvana of total globalization. That turned out to have been wrong. That was more of a hope than a strategy, and I think that main question now is how do we course correct given that China is now very much powerful and very much not liberal?
I want to go to the triumphant part of this story. I want you to be a Chinese politician, a Chinese bureaucrat. You're a member of the Communist Party, the People's Liberation Army. Uh, the last 25 years have been successful, yes or no?
Mostly yes, although there are greater strains because over the last couple of years, there's much more political uncertainty, there is slower economic growth, and there are more social problems, but mostly a giant success.
And so a result of which though, does this make you, because this is what happens to people, we make some good decisions, we get those decisions right, and then we get overconfident. And I'll give a Western example. We make 40-year decisions about containment, the wall comes down, we get very, very smug, and then we make a series of very arrogant decisions.
I think that, I think this goes to my fundamental view about the US and China over the longer term. I think that the competition between the US and China will go on for a very long time. That there is no, way that we can really understand this competition through these structural factors like, let's say, demography or geography. These are insufficient because I think that competition is dynamic. I think that the country that is going to be ahead is going to make mistakes out of overconfidence. And the country that's behind is really going to feel the need to catch up. And so you gave me an example of American overconfidence. Let me reply with an example of Chinese overconfidence. I was living in China in 2021. I was living in Beijing when Xi Jinping decided that he had the COVID pandemic under control, that the transition from Trump to Biden looked really chaotic after January 6th. And this was a moment for him to do big things. And so what did Xi Jinping decide to do? Well, he kind of crushed the property sector. And then he also smacked around a lot of tech entrepreneurs like Jack Ma. And China's economy today is really weak precisely because of these two actions that he undertook about 4 or 5 years ago. And so, I think that these are the sort of things where they're really trying to catch up now. But once they do, they're also going to make mistakes of overconfidence again. So that's why the competition will last a really long time.
Okay, so explain to me the vision though, because I want to understand this. I've got 1 point. I want to be Chinese. And I want to be a communist. I have 1.4 billion people that am in the country. I want to be in total control of them, and I want to censor the media, and I want to suppress their free speech, and then I also want to use technology to get them to conform to whatever the social standards are that I would like them to conform to. And if they don't do that, I'll find ways to penalize them, either using you know, a stable coin that's in renminbi or something like that and take it from them. Uh, and what is the theory behind that? Why is that, in my mind, ultimately going to be successful?
I think that you've identified about half of the program, which is this, agenda of political control and coercion, really to keep the people in check. But I think that the Communist Party also has another half to its agenda, which is to deliver to people what they think that what they believe that the people ought to want. And so, if you're living in a Chinese city or the Chinese countryside, you're getting a lot of new subway stations. You're getting a lot of new parks. You're getting cleaner air. You're getting high-speed rail. You're getting new bridges and new sorts of infrastructure to connect you to the rest of the country and potentially the rest of the world. And a lot of that is being built by the engineers who run Beijing because they think that having these really big monumentalist projects like a giant dam or a giant bridge is going to really impress the people. I think sometimes that's true. I think that, the US used to impress the population with something like the Brooklyn Bridge or the Golden Gate Bridge or the Hoover Dam, whatever it is. But, when you combine this element of coercion with an agenda that very plausibly, is improving people's lives. And then you have the propaganda authorities pointing out to various problems in the West, whether that's, crime in Europe or whether that is, political violence in the U.S. or whatever else. They can kind of plausibly claim to the people that the Communist Party is the best possible ruler for China, and ultimately that's what they want to stay in power. And they can't stay in power unless they're actually delivering some of the goods.
Okay, so let me flip the script then, okay? Because one could argue that you could get more in economic innovation from free speech. We've learned psychologically if we teach our children to speak freely, they innovate. They go on and create Facebook or they make Apple Computer. If we inhibit their free speech, then these countries have a tendency to need to steal intellectual property. Why the insecurity about the openness? It's a vibrant, dynamic economy. We've learned that more innovation comes from liberalism. Uh, what am I getting wrong? Be Chinese for a second. Be a Chinese nationalist for a second, and tell me what I'm getting wrong.
Yeah, well, I think that, first of all, I want to agree with you that they do feel awfully insecure. And it's really strange. You take a look at some of their statements, the way that they bully like a small country like Lithuania, um, which they did a couple of years ago, or they bully a H&M, the fashion retailer, because they make the wrong statement. It does look awfully insecure in all sorts of ways. They really punish a lot of comedians if they use the wrong joke. And so, first of all, it is an insecure place. But if I want to defend some of the aspect of illiberalism, maybe I would say that maybe the Silicon Valley model of innovation is wrong. And I speak to you as a person who spends a lot of time in Silicon Valley because I'm a part of Stanford. And the Silicon Valley approach, since you bring up Apple computers, is that maybe the way to get innovation is that we take Steve Jobs, we throw him into a garage, we send some LSD after him, and somehow an Apple computer comes out of the garage. But someone actually had to make that Apple computer, and that Apple computer, that iPhone, isn't being made in the U.S. anymore. All of it is being made in China, and so they are kind of able to wait for American entrepreneurs, really, to dream up really big ideas. Someone from something like Elon Musk or whatever, and they kind of learn these big ideas. They sort of guess that American companies are no longer very good at building these ideas because over the last 25, 30 years, the American manufacturing base has mostly rusted. It's been a lot of failures in aviation, as well as the semiconductors, as well as manufacturing broadly. And then they just wait for the geniuses to kind of hand over these great ideas into the public. And then they count on Chinese manufacturing prowess to climb all of these ladders that the Americans are laying out for them. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I think you also bring this up in the book, and I want you to elaborate it on here if you don't mind. That's stuff that the U.S. can learn from China, but there's also things that China could learn from the U.S. And so, tell me about that reconciliation.
Yeah, well, I think that the US used to be much better at building monumentalist projects. I mentioned before the Golden Gate Bridge, the Hoover Dam, New York City subway stations. Um, most of these projects were built about 100 years ago. And for basically, essentially since the 1970s, the United States has not built very many projects at all. Penn Station in New York is a gaping pit. The subways are pretty broken. There is like their bridges are collapsing. It just doesn't look very good. And I think that this is something that the Americans really ought to learn more from China. That people want a better level of public works. California, especially, is really bad at providing a lot of functional infrastructure, and I think that more Americans ought to have better infrastructure. So that's something that the Americans can learn from China, and I really hope that the Chinese, the Communist Party, can learn some degree of free speech from the U.S. I wish that there could be better protection of speech rights, better protection of property rights, that there could be more respect for individual people, because I think that Chinese can be really wonderfully creative, really wonderful jokers, great comics, and yet a lot of that is being strangled by the Communist Party because it just really doesn't understand what young people actually want.
Okay, so I mean, I think this is the thing, right? So if you were, since you brought up my age, Dan Wang, let me tell you about
No,
my
you did it
age.
yourself, man. Let's
All
talk
right,
about your
let
age.
me let me let me tell you about my age. So the CIA said, and I quote, in 1979, there's a period of long-term stability for the Shah of Iran. 3 months later, the whole thing exploded in revolution. The CIA said in 1985, and I quote, while the Soviet economy can't produce at the level that our economy is producing at, it is sustainable. There'll be a 25-year continued consolidation of power in the Soviet economy. And of course, 7 short years later, the thing was blowing up. Okay. And so the question is, because we look at things in life and we see this linear progression, Dan, and we think, okay, well, that's going to continue to happen. But is there some things going on under the surface in China that, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we may be surprised about politically? Is there a balkanization of the provinces? Is the young people that you're talking about that are using these VPNs and getting information outside of the control of the Communist Party? Are there things under the surface that maybe an analyst isn't picking up when they say, well, there's a period, they're going to make it to their 100th year 2048 or 49 anniversary, or is there something else afoot?
Yeah, well, you've convinced me, old man. The CIA kind of blows. So, I think that
Especially on
they're
stuff like that. They're probably good at other things, but not really good at predicting. That's for sure.
yeah, well, let's see what their predictions are so that we know what's not going to happen. So, I think that I agree that these kinds of big surprises, these black swans could always happen, but black swans are unpredictable by definition. And, what I would reason from is that, from my years of living there, that the regime has been highly capable, that they don't seem terribly weak, that they have been actually pretty good at responding to crises. I was living in China at the start of the COVID pandemic. Now, of course, they majorly messed up at the very start when they punished whistleblowers and they didn't control the pandemic effectively in the very early days. But after Beijing got on the case, they managed to have a zero COVID policy that for 2 years mostly kept the country, kept transmissions minimal, and kept the economy going for about 2 good years before they all messed up again. And so, I think that the regime looks pretty strong to me, that there is still plenty of economic growth available to it. Their per capita income is about one-sixth the level of American income. And so there's plenty of convergence that ought to be possible. And that the Communist Party has been pretty good at delivering the goods. Now, one could imagine that a lot of these sort of things collapse. I think collapse is always an option. But then I think, what they would be doing is to say, oh, well, let's do this exercise for the rest of the world. Does the United States look terribly strong? Well, Donald Trump is messing up a lot of different things. He's very disruptive. Does Europe look very strong? Well, populist right-wing parties are about to overrun the continent in a couple of years. Plus, they have no growth. And so, if we wanted to do this sort of, what could collapse, I would take it much more seriously to take a look at the entire world. And based on that, I'm not sure that the Chinese look like the weakest of the bunch.
So it's 2049. We are in the midst of celebrating the 100th anniversary of Mao's revolution, or is there something very different happening in China?
Well, maybe you'll be celebrating, Anthony, but I won't be. I think that if they
Okay, so you
are,
think there will be a celebration? I mean, again, I'm not. Look, I'm not. Certainly, me personally, I'm certainly not celebrating that. And remember, I'm old enough to remember George Marshall going over there and trying to see if he could negotiate a peace before the full-on revolution started.
yeah, well, I mean, you must have been alive when, Herbert Hoover was trying to deal with the Great Depression. But, I think that, I think that there will be a celebration in China.
The Chinese Communist Party will still be running China 20 years from today.
I'm expecting that to be the case, and I'll bet you a cup of coffee that they're still going to be
Okay,
running the
well, no,
country then.
you're smarter than me. I'm assuming that will also be the case. But looking ahead, though, Dan, when you think about technology and infrastructure and state power, where do you see the greatest risk of conflict potentially between the U.S. and China over the next decade?
The island nation of Taiwan could be an obvious powder keg, as well as these islands around the South China Sea, because the Chinese are very clear in saying that Taiwan belongs to Beijing. They really want to seize the island, and they also claim some degree of sovereignty, as well as possession over all sorts of these smaller islands across the South Pacific, which are also contested by other countries, including the United States. And so, if Xi Jinping ever decides to seize Taiwan, then the American president has to make a choice whether they defend this island, which is a democracy in that is hanging off essentially pretty close off the coast of China, whether the United States really needs to send a lot of forces to defend this a democracy that is pretty pro-American. And maybe so, maybe not. But if the troops do actually sail over there, then that is a pretty obvious potential for conflict between the two. Otherwise, I don't think that the American troops really want to occupy China. They're not going to seize Shandong province. And the Chinese don't want to seize Oregon state. What would they do with Oregon? But when it comes to these minor, islands in the Pacific as well as Taiwan, that's the more obvious trigger.
And so the American president, so a likelihood in the next decade that there will be a military move. Obviously, they're trying to. I mean, they would like the same thing to happen to Taiwan that happened to Hong Kong or happened in Macau, right? They would just want a natural absorption. But barring that, do you think that they would move militarily in the next decade?
I think that they are going to have to think about what the American president is going to do. And so maybe that's more a question for you, Anthony. You've spoken to him more than I have. What do you think he would do in that sort of situation?
Right now, I think his military advisors are telling him that it's a toss up and that therefore he has to stay the course in terms of this strategic ambiguity because in a toss up and recognizing what happened with Ukraine in terms of the crippling sanctions on Russia, et cetera, that the Chinese would, they're long term thinkers. There'd be no reason for them to move while there's a toss up. If there was a uh, flip, if we became less supportive of the Pacific region, if we moved the fleet, example, things like that, or we retracted from the region, which I don't predict we're going to do at least in the last 3 years of the Trump term, then I think it becomes a little bit harder to defend the island. So to me, as long as the party thinks that there's a toss up, I don't think they're going to move on that island. Now, maybe I'm wrong on that, but remember, you had 20 miles to go from England into France, and that's 80 years ago. It was a very hard amphibious trek to make that assault. It's an 80-mile straight, so it's 4 times the size. And yes, we have better technology today, but that's also a very rocky, difficult terrain, Taiwan. It's not a flat surface. There's a lot of complication there, and those, of course, are very, very smart people, and they've been preparing for this for, almost a century now in terms of defending that island. And what we've learned from the Ukrainians, that people they'll dig in and they'll defend their land to the death. So it's not clear to me that the Chinese are going to move on it, given everything that I know from a military perspective. But if you think I'm wrong, push back.
No,
I
that all
don't
makes
think
sense to
Trump.
me.
I don't think Trump. I don't think he gives two shits about that island. Okay, other than the fact that there's semiconductor chips being produced there, and the Chinese don't have the compromise on Trump that the Russians do. So he's not as afraid of Xi as he is Putin. But the flip side is that as long as he doesn't need to do anything, he won't. It'll be up to the American military to stay fortified in that region. And again, remember, you're talking to an internationalist. You're talking to somebody that sees the world from a balance of power perspective. I'm not a tripolar MAGA Trump supporter. I'm somebody that believes that we need to embolden the West to protect its interests because there's only we're in the minority, my friend. Okay, we have 5.9 billion people living under some type of totalitarian regime. So we'll have to see. All right. Well, we're down to the last. So if you've listened to this podcast before, we come up with 5 words. I'm going to say the word from your book. I want you to give me a sentence or two. Okay, you ready?
Yeah, sounds good.
All right. So Dan, I say the future. I say future. You say what?
I say that Americans and Chinese both believe in the future, whereas Europeans and Japanese seem to have a sense of optimism only about the past.
Okay, it's interesting. I agree with that. Okay, it's very astute observation. Engineering. I say the word engineering. You say what?
I think that the Chinese want to engineer the physical environment. They want to engineer the economy. They are also engineers of the human soul.
I say the word breakneck, the title of your book. You say what?
I think that the Chinese are really moving forward at breakneck speed. They are able to move fast and break things. They're also able to move fast and break people.
It's a very powerful book you've written, my friend. Okay, I say the word America. You say what?
I think that it is pluralistic, um, dysfunctional, and needs to get a lot better than today.
You need a more rational policy, less of this bipartisan policy, less of this polarity, I think, is what I would say. Okay, I'm going to give you the last word, and this is the last word. I say China. You say what?
I think that it is a fabulously interesting place that is also growing politically darker year by year.
Okay, listen, I think it's an incredible book. I'm very grateful to Professor Ferguson for giving me this book. The
Me
title of the
too.
book is Breakneck. It's China's quest to engineer the future. It is a brilliant exposition of what is going on, and it's a real examination of the facts. Dan, I think you've written a great book. I hope people go out and buy it, and I appreciate you joining us today on Open Book.
Thank you very much, Anthony.